In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, that's right. Well, we are in the book of Daniel. We're returning to it. We've spent 2 weeks away. We spent time for Palm Sunday, and we spent time for Easter last week. But in the book of Daniel, we've been focusing on the theme of faithfulness. That we see that God is faithful. And then we see that some of his people are faithful. And we see that even though the rulers of the world, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the most powerful empire of the time, and possibly of all history. I mean, so much of what we do today was influenced by the Babylonian Empire. Even though they think they're in charge, God's in charge. That ultimately, he's the one that's giving all things. And even the victory that Nebuchadnezzar had, he took the people of Israel into his country and they're away in Babylon. It says that God gave them over to him. So who's really in control? And so we see God's faithfulness all throughout this book. And so we're dialing in because we want to be faithful people. You know, you may ask yourself as we go into this talk today and say, you know, what has God called me to be faithful with? Who has God called me to be faithful with? And, you know, there's so many demands upon us these days, and we can get confused and think that there's all this other stuff we're supposed to be doing or focused on or perform with, and yet really, we're only supposed to just be faithful with that which God has called us to be faithful with. And if you listen, dial in, God has certain things that he's called you to be faithful with because you're unique. There's no one like you. There's never been anyone like you in all of history. God made you as a one of a kind. And he designed you with a purpose. And for your life, for you to be faithful looks different than anybody else. And so faithfulness can be seen as trustworthiness in relation to others, and also fidelity towards others. If someone or something does what they or it were designed to do, or have agreed to do, then someone or something is faithful in that relationship. And a few of us went up to a men's retreat in Iowa, Story City, Iowa. Beautiful. Men, I'd encourage you to plan on going next year. It's good stuff always. But up there, we're in these cabins, and the cabin that we were in, and I had stayed in this one a couple years ago, and I remembered this after a few times. But, you know, you open the door to the bathroom, and there's this towel dispenser just right next to where you open the door. And if you don't step far enough away from the towel dispenser wide, the towel dispenser just spits out paper towels because it doesn't know that your shoulder is not your hand. And so I got up a few times at night, and you know, it's the guys are sleeping right there, and so I'd open up, and all of a sudden it's all quiet. I'm trying to be quiet, and all of a sudden, and so a couple of times I said, "Stop it," you know, and it didn't speak to me, but it kind of just said, "Well, this is what I do." It was faithful to what it was designed to do. And just said, well, this is what I'm doing. What are you talking about, buddy? Like, you're not going to get anything else out from me. And oh, that we would be that way. You know, that we would know God to the place that we would just say, yeah, no matter what anybody else says, I'm faithful to what he's called me to do. The speaker, Jim Plank, Vineyard pastor, he said something that a couple of the guys pointed out, and you may have heard it in different ways. Jim didn't come up with it, but he said it recently, and so I'll credit it to him. But he said, you know, God doesn't need impressive men. He needs faithful men. You know, and I mean, think about that. I mean, everything seems today if you can just be impressive, if you can just be really fantastic, amazing, right? I mean, isn't that the call, especially, you know, young people, and you're in here like, man, I just really have to be special. And yet, all that really God designed things to be is if you can just be faithful, if you can just be faithful with what he's given to you. And so in the chapter we're reading, there's nearly 40 years of events that have happened since chapter 4. And so plenty of time has gone on. Daniel now is close to 90 years old. This is actually what we read, the end of the time where they're in captivity. Shortly after what we read today, they will actually bring the people out of captivity, or they can actually go back and start to rebuild Jerusalem. The rest of the book of Daniel is recounting some of the things that happened in between chapter 4 and chapter 5, like prophetic things that God spoke to him. And so by the time we end the chapter, what we'll be able to do today is be able to point to a sequence of faithfulness. Because if we're talking about faithfulness, it's not something that we can just say, all right, I'm going to be faithful. It's like we need to understand the sequence of faithfulness, because that is the way to do it. You know, it's not something we can necessarily knock out of the park just on our own. So let's read Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So Belshazzar was actually the son of Nabonidus, who was held captive by the Persian king Cyrus. So it says he's the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but he's actually the grandson. And there was actually some other kings that came after Nebuchadnezzar, but one got killed quickly, and then this person came in, and then Belshazzar's dad was the king, but then he was taken captive, and Belshazzar was actually kind of co-regent with his dad in a sense, because his dad's still alive, but he's held captive by Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persians. And so what happens is he's ruling right now. And there's a little bit of kind of like, well, the cat's away, the mice will play. And Belshazzar is not leading well. He's not being very faithful with what God has shown him. And so it says there was 1,000 nobles there, but that means that there's many more attendees than that 1,000. And I'm not sure exactly how it works, because they've actually unearthed the meeting hall that was here in the area where Babylon was. And it was something like 50-something wide and 170 long. And as I do the math on that, at least if you look under Wyandotte County, how many people you're supposed to fit in that space, it's only in the hundreds or so, maybe up to 1,000. But apparently there was thousands of people, plenty of people. And they typically would just mention the most important people, and then there was others. But it says that there was wives and concubines and different people there. And what they did is he said, let's grab the gold and silver goblets that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem. So these were the actual things that were created for the purpose of worship of Yahweh. And he says, like, hey, let's just let's just use them for something that is completely different than worship. And he's following a theme of saying that our God is greater, or I am greater than their God, because we conquered them. And so he's like shaking his fist at God, and he's kind of saying, like, I can do what I want. Like, man, I don't know this God that everybody talks about, but I think I've got it all together. And so these things would have actually been used in the temple and worship of God. And what they did is they drank wine from the goblets, and while getting drunk and having sex and praising other gods is what they did. Because if the women and the men typically would not be around each other socially, especially in large environments like this. And so most of the time when they were brought together in these environments like this, it was for an orgy. And so that's the scene that we have here. And notice they praise the gods of created things. So they praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And yet they didn't praise the one that made gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Isn't that a picture of our hearts a lot of times? is that we love to praise the things that have created things, but we forget about the one that started it all. So Belshazzar broke all sorts of protocols. He was actually not even supposed to be drinking with the nobles. He wasn't supposed to go there. But he was unfaithful to the knowledge he had of God. You see, because we read later on that Daniel calls him out. He knew that God had shown that he was the true God. He knew that God had made it clear, like the Hebrews that were thrown into the fiery furnace. He had heard these stories of how God rescued them and the fire couldn't touch them. And he had heard how his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had been thrown out into the wilderness, and because he was so prideful before God, and yet then he praised God and said that the Hebrews' God is the true God. He had heard all these stories, and yet still he chose a different narrative. And really, we can look at it and we can judge him, or we can learn from him and make him our best friend, because we too end up there pretty quickly. And it's kind of like this. There's different places in the world where the tides are very low and very high. Like there's places in Canada, and then also in Anchorage. There's actually places where the tide will go way out and then come back in. There's mud flats right outside of Anchorage. And sometimes people get out there and walk to this island called Fire Island. And I don't know if this sign is actually from that exact place. And but the sign says, it says, warning, you are in danger of being cut off by incoming tide. And it's actually a really perilous thing, is that people, when they see the tide go way out, what they'll do is they'll just walk around. I mean, kind of cool, right? Walk around where there's usually water. And there's actually the Bay of Fundy in Canada. And some of these places, it's a difference of 55 feet that the water goes up. So every so often what happens is somebody doesn't, play it right. Because not only as the water comes back in, you have to outrun the water, but somehow the ground or the soil or the mud starts to soften as well, as the water's coming back not just above the water but up ground too. So that's, I think, what's happening with Belshazzar. It happens with us is that we begin to live a certain way, and maybe we choose our ways over God's ways, and the tide is all the way out. We're like, hey, I wasn't really sure that this way of doing this, would be okay, but I guess it's okay. But it appears that, one thing that we know about God is that he's long suffering. He's patient with us. And, there's very few things that if we do, that it's just done, right? That judgment or consequences come right away. But then there's stuff that we just say, the tide's out, but then the tide comes back in. And the problem is that we think we're in control of everything. Like, I have 3 sons, and actually today's Liberation Day. We've raised 3 adults now. So yeah, our youngest, it's his birthday today, and he's 18. And so, we raised 3 adults. So I don't know what that means. I mean, I'm still supporting them and helping them. They're still eating my food and all kinds of stuff and everything else. But all that to say is that I would tell them, can I go to such and such a place, Dad? And can I go hang out with these people or do this thing? And as they got older, I said yes more. And I just said, yeah, you can do that. But I want you to think about something, is that's a situation where there's lots of different things going on, and you think that you can control an uncontrollable situation, but that's an uncontrollable situation. So which means that you need to recognize that stuff just happens. And Belshazzar thinks that he has total control, but the tide is about to come back in on him. And so verse 5, it says, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the king watched the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale. And he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. So this is where the term the writing on the wall comes from, right? Not everybody says that, but some people say that. But you can imagine how frightening this would have been because, they didn't have lights like this. They had lamps that were filled with oil and different things. And so it was smoky. And it would have been pretty dim. And, it's in the evening and they're doing all the shenanigans that we talked about. And all of a sudden, on the wall, you see just a hand, and it's writing. And it's writing in Aramaic. And so we'll talk about that they all knew what the words were. And all of a sudden, they look, and King Belshazzar, his whole countenance changes. And what it's saying is that, like, his joints and his hips and his legs just, quaking, just shaking back and forth because he's so shocked at what he's seen. Isn't that how it is in life, that we kind of just get in the mode of just doing life and everything's good, but then we have these moments where all of a sudden we're brought back into reality of what all of this is about, whether it's our mortality or whether, the reality of God comes back in or any of those things. But in those moments, and maybe our hips and our knees don't start to quake, but at least maybe our souls and our hearts do in our minds, and we say, wait a minute, I need to wake up here. It says his face turned white. In verse 7, it says, the king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain. It looks like a rapper, right? Clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around its neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Notice he says the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Typically, kings would say, you be the second, my second, in these kind of situations. But it shows that because some people say that this isn't true. They try to disprove the Bible and show that God's not real. But they've failed miserably, because this shows right here that, because they say there wasn't a king named Belshazzar as far as the Babylonians. The problem is this tells us right here that it was this thing where his dad was the king and he was ruling, and the reason he's only able to give him the third in the kingdom is because he's the second, currently playing the first, but he only has power to give the third. And so he offers this to anybody, and it says, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So even more terrified and pale, his strength and resources came up empty. That's the other thing that we many times miscalculate, is that we put just an emphasis on our ability and our strength to handle just anything, right? There's principles of money, and there's principles of health, and there's principles of relationships and all those things, but we don't trust in those. If we're wise, we do those, right? To have healthy finances and healthy relationships and healthy bodies and those things. But the reality is that we can build up all the strength that we want, and yet it's frail, right? If we're paying attention, we are incredibly frail beings. And the reason we're so frail is we were created to have a deep reliance upon God, to have a deep relationship with him. And many times our frailty comes as we look at this world and we worship this world. We worship this world as the crescendo, is the summit of all things. And yet this world is just a small instance in overall part of our lives, which is eternity, right? We're beings that will continue, right? Even though we have these moments of death, each of us will. We continue throughout all eternity. And the life that we live here will continue through. And so Belshazzar has found that his strength and resources are empty. I got nothing. He's called on his wise people, and he just says, I have no idea what to do about this. And yet we find out about Daniel that he's still there. Notice that Daniel is not one of the people that he calls in. So even though he was in great importance at one point, right? Nebuchadnezzar gave him hey, you're one of the most powerful people in the kingdom, and yet now he's off to the side, right? He's not a part of the big game. it would appear these on the bench as far as the important things that are happening. And I was thinking, some of us may feel that way today. We may feel and evaluate our life and think that, maybe, we're done. Maybe times or, I guess I'm not part of it anymore. But then there's deep inside of you, you're like, but I still want to use all that God's given me. And yet maybe because you made a mistake, or maybe because people relegated you to the sidelines, or I don't know what it could be. Or maybe you just got stinking thinking going so long that you just have told yourself that you're not a part of the game or what's happening. And notice today with Daniel, he's almost 90 years old, and the entire country, the most important empire in the world, and because he stayed faithful to God and faithful to what he's supposed to do, even though he's probably just sitting on his porch, just, telling kids to slow down as they ride their chariots past him. Hey, Daniel, we need you. But in the long obedience in the same direction, he's able at the moment to be impactful because he stayed faithful to God. So verse 10, it says, the queen, now this would have been Belshazzar's mother or actually his grandmother, possibly, not his wife. Hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. And notice she's wise enough not to be there, right? Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you. And this is written in Aramaic. The first chapter is written in Hebrew, and then there's several chapters written in Aramaic, and then they go back to Hebrew. But the reason is he says the spirit of the gods. Aramaic, it can't really say the spirit of God. It's kind of, the writing really has to be plural. But really, ultimately, as everybody says that, what they're saying is they're saying the spirit of God is in you. You're filled with the spirit of God. You're filled with the Holy Spirit, we would understand. I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and to tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read the writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And so Daniel was full of faith in the Holy Spirit after this whole time. And this goes back to, what has God called you to be faithful for? And are you being faithful with it? Typically, it's people and giftings and talents and activities. And the problem is there's so many distractions. And yet, if we are faithful with the people and the things that God has given us, then we have incredible use in the world. And all Daniel's doing is he's just doing what God has had him do since he was a teenager. And he's just going after that calling that God has put in him. You may feel that today. You may feel like you're spinning your wheels and you're just kind of in a place of, I don't know, I'm just doing stuff. I don't know that there's tons of meaning, right? I mean, we have more information than any time in history, right? I mean, we can pull out something out of our pocket and we can find pretty much anything that's ever been learned or written or ideas. But there's lots of information, but very little meaning, right? And meaning and purpose is found in our faithfulness. And so Daniel finds that. In verse 17, Daniel answers the king. Now listen to what he says. The dude's a stud. He's just absolutely 90 years old. And he was like this when he was 17, though, when he started. But he says to him, he says, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. He says, I don't need your gold chain. I don't need your rewards. I don't need your position. I mean, that's what's so awesome is that when we are faithful, which God has given to us, and we foster what God has called us to, we're untouchable. Like we're not led after things that are tempting, because we know that pay dirt is just being faithful with what God has given us to. And so he says, nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your majesty, the most high God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory. Notice the word gave there. He's dialing Belshazzar back in and like, hey man, you think you're in control, you're the king. Let me remind you of what's really going on. Because of the high position he gave, verse 19, him, all the nations and people of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praise the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. I mean, look at that last part there. But so you did all of this, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life in all your ways. So is the story of all people. That's the base thing that we're to do, is to acknowledge and to be faithful to the one that has given us our very lives. All the other things are distractions if we don't get that. So Daniel points to God's sovereignty and his faithfulness, and he says, the Most High God, in verse 18, gave your grandfather this. So he's bringing it all back. Look, everything you have is from God. And we might be reminded of that today too and say, everything that we have is from God. Yes, he has given us gifts and we put out effort and we work hard and we do different things. But he created all of that. And out of his goodness, he gave it to us. Like even there being good things, he created good things that we would even go after them and be able to get them. Daniel reminds of the pride of Nebuchadnezzar and how God humbled him. In verse 20, it says, but when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. But then it says he acknowledged the Most High God as sovereign over all kingdoms and earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. That's the key thing, is sets over him anyone he wishes. Is that if you read Scripture, if you read the whole account of Scripture, listen, it shows over and over again that people think like, hey, the tide isn't ever coming back. And I'm in control and no one could do this without me. It's a warning too for all of us, for the jobs that we have, the things that we do, that look, we all are replaceable. Like to a position or to a thing, whether we're, the president of the United States or the president of France or the Pope or, leader of something we're all replaceable. And it appears that God every so often allows the tide to go back in when not expected. And that's happening to Belshazzar here. Daniel holds a mirror up to Belshazzar and he says, look, Nebuchadnezzar changed, but you, Belshazzar, you've not humbled yourself. Like God has spoken to you. He's speaking to you. He's made it clear to you. The writing is literally on the wall, buddy. And yet you have not humbled yourself. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You know, I listen to a lot of loud music. I still do. Driving down the 5 freeway in Southern California with Rich in his Camaro. Lots of loud music. And it's like, man, someday is this going to hurt us? And all of a sudden, someday's here. And so there's moments where Michelle and I will be watching a movie or things, or we're in a crowd. I'm like, hey, what'd they say? You know, and she's like, and she always typically will think that I'm asking about the thing before they said. And I said, no, not that, the next thing, you know, and it's this whole thing. And so she's really excited this time is in our lives, you know, now. And here's what I'll tell you. God is a really clear communicator. Like, really clear communicator. He absolutely is communicating clearly with you and I. And if I don't hear, or you don't hear, it's not on him. Like, he's communicating really clearly to you and really clearly to me in our lives right now. He's warning us. He's loving us. He's directing us. And yet we can do things to damage our hearing devices to the point that we, what? Verse 25, it says what this is all about. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parson. Now, your version, if you may have a different version, it says, it may say Upharsin. Okay. Here is what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, or Upharsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain, and placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. I think, reading into it, I think that Daniel let him put the stuff on him, and as he walked out of the hall and all this stuff was still going on and it was quiet, he probably threw off the purple, threw off the gold, in kind of a mic drop moment. Because at that moment, what was happening, and all the history books tell this, is that the Mede and Persians, or like Iran, what you would know today, but it was a joined kingdom. They had this huge army outside of Babylon. And instead of just like really coming with force, what they did is they redirected a stream of the Euphrates River, and they redirected it to this swamp area and made it a huge lake. They redirected the water because the water flew into Babylon, and they lowered the depth enough that they could just walk in and nobody knew it. This huge party was going on, and they didn't even know that at that moment they were being taken over. And so the history books confirm that at that moment this all happened. But I mentioned the sequence of faithfulness. Here's what it is. And if you don't choose God to be your sequence of faithfulness, or be the one that's the foundation of it, then you choose something else. Maybe it's you, or maybe it's, like one of the, they had gods for gold and bronze and these things. We choose all kinds of other gods too, all kinds of other things. But if we choose God as our sequence and the one that we're a part of, then the foundation of the sequence of faithfulness is that God is faithful. The only way that we can ever be faithful, the only way that we can ever be faithful to what we're called to or anything else is because God is faithful. Lamentations 3:22 through 23, it says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. God's faithfulness is connected to his love for you. And actually, if you're faithful or not faithful, it doesn't change his love for you. It just changes how you experience his love. The things that he does for you, if you're faithful and recognize him, you'll experience depths of those things that you never thought possible. If you're unfaithful and don't recognize him, you'll just chalk it up to, it's kind of cool. You know, good stuff just always happens to me. Huh. And so it's built upon God's faithfulness. Now, people, we have to learn faithfulness. We're all broken in some way or another, so we have to learn faithfulness. And so when people are unfaithful, what God does with us is he warns us clearly and calls us to humble ourselves. And again, he communicates clearly if we listen. And when we don't heed the warning and humble ourselves, then typically judgment comes through trouble. In other words, the tide comes back in. Now, Galatians, Paul wrote that faithfulness is a fruit of the Spirit. And so we learn faithfulness by being with God. Jesus is the faithful one. And so as we're with him, we gain faithfulness from him. And then also, too, in the book of Luke 16, verse 10, Jesus said this. And what it tells us is it tells us that faithfulness positions us for more or less. If we're unfaithful, we'll get less. If we're faithful, we get more. It says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with very much. So, in the confusion of this life, what if you and I were just faithful? What if we were just faithful with what we have and trusted God with it and wait and see what happens? There's a song from 20 plus years ago by Vineyard worship leader Scott Underwood. And it says this: faithfulness, faithfulness is what I long for. Faithfulness is what I need. Yes, it is. Faithfulness, faithfulness is what you want from me. So take my heart, God. So take my heart and form it. Take my mind, transform it. Take my will, conform it to yours, O Lord.